evening and welcome to the age-old question, how did we get here? The question of creation versus evolution. And we have two very respected individuals that are going to be speaking tonight. Miss Nye, you might recognize her from the science show, Bill Nye the Science Guy. And Mr. Ham, Ken Ham, who is a very respected creationist / scientist among the Christian realm. And these two respected persons are going to debate the question. Now, it just so happened that before we had a coin toss, and Mr. Ham won and opted to go first. So with that said, he is going to have 1 to 2 minutes to share a few points on how he believes we got here. Is the creation model a viable belief to how we got here? Mr. Ham.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, I'm going to start with some facts and a lot of questions that evolutionists have. Some of them think that, all creationist scientists are not good because they're all bent towards religion. Well, that's not really true. And actually, a while back, creationists made a diagram. It's called the origin orchard. And what it was, it pretty much showed the origin of the things from creation to the flood and after the flood. And years later, evolutionists actually came up with a very similar chart showing the origin of the dog. So, which is kind of fishy because evolutionists are using what creation has made, and also I know a friend who's made the MRI scanner, and he is a very profound creationist. So it doesn't just show that you have to be an evolutionist to be a good scientist. Also, I think, and then another question is layers and the age of layers. A lot of times evolutionists will say, the Earth is millions of years old because of the layers. Well, not really, because Mount St. Helens, when it erupted in 1980, it formed tons and tons of layers very, very quickly. It even carved out a canyon, a very large canyon. Also, we found trees petrified in the layers, and so this tree starts in maybe 10 layers and it goes all the way up to maybe 100 layers. It spans many layers, and that tree is now millions of years old. It's very obvious that it's not. And then also, his science. The word science evolutionists have hijacked. They think observational and historical are the same. Well, observational science is stuff you can see and stuff that you can observe in labs and stuff, test it. Historical is what has happened in the past and we cannot repeat it. So what they do is they teach historical science as observational science, which is a very bad thing to do. They do not cross. With that.
Thank you, Mr. Ham. You may have a seat. Miss Nye, please rise. And we'll also give you 1 to 2 minutes to share your viewpoint.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, there are lots of different questions of the differences with Christianity and evolution, and I'm just going to go over what creationist, or more specific, Ken Ham, believes. So, he believes that there's a 6,000-year-old Earth and that the flood happened roughly 4,000 years ago. Now, to me, this is, how could this happen when we find tree examples that date back, you can count the rings to 9,550 years old. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And where Ken Ham, he says the flood happened 4,000 years ago, and if we find trees this old, then you take a tree sapling and you cover it in water and let it soak there, it just won't survive. So how could the flood be 4,000 years ago if we find trees that are 9,000 years old? It's just simply not logical. And my second question for you, Mr. Ham, is the Grand Canyon. So if there was a flood 4,000 years ago, and that is a very big debate, you believe it happened over a short period of time. I personally believe it happened over millions of years. But if you say it happened from a mudslide, why aren't there more Grand Canyons around in the world? That is my question for you. And thank you.
Thank you, Miss Nye. And that concludes round 1. At this point, we're going to transition into round 2, where Miss Nye will now enter. and Mr. Nye will now enter. They may look a little different, but make no mistake, they represent Mr. Ham's creation view of the world and Miss Nye's evolutionist view of the world. So, because of the coin toss, we will once again go with Mr. Ham for round 1. 1 to 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Okay, so my first point is, today in public schools, they're not teaching that is a difference between, they're teaching that there's not a difference between observational and historical science. They're teaching that it's all combined into one and that evolutionists are scientists. But in public schools, yeah, that's what they're teaching. But not only evolutionists are scientists. I have a friend that's actually a creationist and he's a scientist. And there's also creationist doctors, there's creationist and evolutionist archaeologists and paleontologists and a whole bunch of different people. But my point is, in public schools, they're teaching that there is not a difference. But there is a difference between historical and observational science. And kids need to be learning that because they're just saying that there's not a difference. So that's my...
Thank you, Mr. Ham. You may have a seat. Miss Nye, please arise and share a few thoughts for 1 to 2 minutes on your viewpoint.
Okay, so like the Ark, it was built by Noah and his family, which is like 8 people, including his sons and their wives. And they're an unskilled family, and they built a huge ark bigger than any man has been able to build because we use machines nowadays. So it was built and it was huge, and then it had tons of animals. It had all kinds of animals come into it, and then the flood happened, and then it just landed safely on a mountain. That just doesn't seem really logical. So, in I think Europe, they ran a test in the early 1900s. Some really skilled shipbuilders built a ship close to the size of the Ark, but not quite that big. And then it is called the Wyoming. And then whenever they put it on the ocean, it would twist. And then as it would twist, water would leak in, and then it eventually sunk and all the crew died. And then, so I just don't see how it was logical that a ship even bigger and longer would survive in the sea for way longer than that did. That's it.
Thank you, Miss Nye. That concludes round 2. At this point, we're going to change the rules of the game just slightly. We're still going to have Mr. Ham and Miss Nye entering. Although they look a little different, it will still represent Miss Nye's view of creation and Mr. Nye's view of creation. What I'd like for you to take a look at is, as they enter here, I'm going to ask them questions, and they are to respond to my question for 1 to 2 minutes. Once again, I'm going to specifically refer to Mr. Ham first, and for his first question, Mr. Ham, I would like to know, outside of the Bible that you believe in, is there any evidence that points to a 6,000-year-old Earth? Mr. Ham?
Yes, thank you, Speaker. I would say that as a creationist, I would strongly believe that there was a worldwide flood in the early years of the Earth. And as evidence of a worldwide flood, I can walk into my backyard and pick up a stone in my driveway that has a fossil of a trilobite or a sea-dwelling creature. I mean, how did it get there if it just makes sense that a worldwide flood would have caused animals to come on mainland and then they got buried in mud. So then you could find fossils of trilobites and sea creatures. And I would also say that prophecies are one of the most valid objective evidences for the reliability of the Bible, meaning that people in the Bible have made prophecies, and later, outside of the Bible and our history that we know today, these prophecies have come true. One of these examples would be the Tyre and Sodom prophecy that Ezekiel made, and he prophesied that it would be destroyed, and later Nebuchadnezzar did destroy it, and that the ruins would be thrown into the sea. and later Alexander the Great threw the ruins into the sea to get to the island about a half-mile off and destroyed the island where the people were dwelling with other nations such as the ones that he had destroyed earlier with their navy. So really all the prophecies have came true, and there are many others, and the Bible is really the only source or the only religious book that has prophecies that have came true. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hand. Very well put. Now, Miss Nye, I must apologize. I don't know if you noticed, but when you were coming on stage, I said she's going to be defending her creationist view. Most certainly, Miss Nye does not believe in a creator, but she is going to defend her evolutionist view. So I'd like for Miss Nye to please arise, and I'm going to ask her a question. What I'd like to ask Miss Nye is, can you reconcile the change of rate of the continents drifting 6,000 years ago compared to the rate that they're changing now? Miss Nye?
Yes, yes I can, but this would have been way easier to explain over a century ago because the existence of tectonic plates was proven then. So if you, like I heard this story, if you go into a clock store and there's a bunch of clocks, all the clocks are not exactly going to say the same time. So do you think they're all wrong? So one of the reasons is we see the tectonic plates moving is what we call a seafloor spreading in the mid-Atlantic, and it's when the Earth's magnetic field has reversed over millions of years, causing the plates to drift, and it leaves signature identifications in the rock, and it shows that they're rubbing against each other, so it might be rough, it might be smooth, it just depends. So yes, you can measure how fast the continents are moving. And another example of the tectonic plates and how fast the continents are moving is Mount St. Helens is an example of different continents when it exploded and it destroyed lots. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miss Nye. Very well put. That concludes round 3. So now we will transition into round 4. We welcome back Mr. Nye, Miss Nye, and Mr. Ham to round 4, as they will once again have 1 to 2 minutes to share how they believe what they believe. Still waiting on Mr. Ham to join us. He must have had to take a bathroom break. Mr. Ham, welcome. Miss Nye, welcome. And we'd like to now ask Miss Nye to share first, as it's going to be a reversal of positions. Go ahead, Miss Nye.
Thank you. So, as I was over on my way here, I just stopped on the side of the road and I picked up this. This is a fossil, and inside on it you could see that there are trilobite figures. And it's obvious to tell that they have lived their whole life, which is normally 20 years of a lifespan of a trilobite. And to me, it's just fascinating that we are standing on millions of years of ancient life. That is just remarkable. But my question for you, Mr. Ham, is how could I find this fossil that has lived its whole life if you claim the flood was only 4,000 years ago? Well, trilobites, even though this one has just lived 20 years, there are millions of these over the earth, and which would add up way past 4,000 years. And the fact is, Mr. Ham, is there's not enough time to form all the fossils we find today. And I have another question for you. The chalk deposits, like the Great White Cliffs of Dover, if you claim the flood was only 4,000 years ago, there is definitely not enough time to form all those chalk deposits. It's just not logical. And thank you.
Wow, Miss Nye, those are some challenging questions. And now we're going to turn it over to Mr. Ham here for his 1 to 2 minute expository speaking on his creationist view. Mr. Ham.
All right. Well, first of all, it doesn't take millions of years to form a fossil. I will tell you that now. There we in Australia and other places we've found petrified hats, petrified cowboy boots. We've seen water wheels that were built and slowly get petrified, but we've actually observed it getting petrified. We've actually been able to do in labs petrify fossils that look exactly like original. So it does not take millions of years to form a fossil. And also, like I said earlier, the layers aren't necessarily thousands and millions of years old.